You've seen it. Even if you weren't alive when they were on the road, you know the shape. That bulky yellow steel brick that looks less like a car and more like a rolling bank vault. It's in the background of Taxi Driver, it's dropping off characters and friends, and it's likely the first image that pops into your head when someone says the words New York City. For decades, the Checker cab wasn't just a vehicle, it was part of the American landscape, as permanent as the Empire State Building and as reliable as the sunrise. But then, almost overnight, they vanished. You don't see them anymore. You don't hear that distinct mechanical clatter or smell that mixture of old vinyl and gasoline that defined a century of urban transport. And it makes you wonder, if this machine was so perfect, so incredibly tough that it could rack up 1,000,000 miles without breaking a sweat, why does it no longer exist? And I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten machinery that built the modern world. If you're someone who loves deep dives into automotive history and wants to understand the brutal economics behind why good cars die, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about the Checker. It didn't die because it was a bad car. It didn't die because it was unreliable. In fact, if you look at the engineering, the Checker A11 was arguably one of the most durable consumer vehicles ever built by human hands. It died because of a paradox that terrifies every modern manufacturer. It was too good. It was built to last forever in an economy that demands things break. But that's only half the story. The real reason Checker disappeared involves a Russian tailor, a literal mafia war on the streets of Chicago, a financial scandal that ruined the family legacy, and the refusal to change that went from being a strength to a fatal flaw. Now, you might be thinking, it's just a taxi, how complicated can the history be? Look, the story of Checker Motors is actually the story of the American industrial spirit, both the ugly side and the beautiful side. To understand why it failed, we have to go back to a time when the streets weren't filled with Ubers or even regulated taxis, but with anarchy. We have to talk about Morris Markin. He wasn't a car guy. He didn't grow up dreaming of engines like Henry Ford. He was a survivor. Born in Smolensk, Russia in 1913, he grew up in poverty so crushing it's hard for us to even imagine today. When he arrived at Ellis Island at age 19, he didn't speak English. He didn't have a degree. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and a debt he incurred just to get into the country. Most people realize that the American dream is about working hard, but here's what most people don't realize. For guys like Markin, it was about ruthless efficiency. He started as a tailor in Chicago. He didn't just sew clothes, he optimized the process. He worked until his fingers bled, saved every cent, and eventually bought the shop. By the time World War I rolled around, he wasn't just a tailor. He was a government contractor making uniforms. This is where it gets really interesting. The leap from sewing pants to building cars seems insane, right? It's like a bakery suddenly deciding to manufacture jet engines. But for Markin, it wasn't about the product, it was about the opportunity. He had loaned money to an auto body engineer named Lomberg. When Lomberg couldn't pay him back, Markin didn't panic. He took the business. He absorbed another failing company, Commonwealth Motors, and suddenly the tailor was an automaker. In 1922, Checker Cab Manufacturing was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But Markin did something that separated him from every other car maker of the era. Ford, GM, and Chrysler were trying to sell cars to you, the private citizen. They wanted to put a car in every driveway. Markin didn't care about driveways. He cared about the curb. He looked at the taxi industry and saw that everyone was doing it wrong. They were taking regular passenger cars, Fords and Chevys, painting them yellow and running them into the ground. These cars weren't designed to run 24 hours a day. They had flimsy suspensions, cramped back seats, and engines that overheated in traffic. Markin's genius was realizing that a taxi is not a car. A taxi is a tool. It's an industrial machine, like a forklift or a tractor. So he built the Checker Model A specifically for the job. He didn't care about aerodynamics or 0 to 60 times. He cared about headroom, legroom, and durability. He built a car that a passenger could walk into wearing a top hat without bending down. He built a car where the parts were interchangeable, so when a fender got smashed, and in 1920 Chicago, fenders always got smashed, you could bolt on a new one in 20 minutes. This philosophy of purpose-built utility became the company's DNA. But having a good product wasn't enough. You needed territory. And this brings us to the taxi wars. Now, when I say war, I'm not using a metaphor. In the 1920s in Chicago and New York, the taxi business was controlled by organized crime and fierce competition. The biggest rival was Yellow Cab, run by John Hertz. Yes, the rental car guy. Drivers carried crowbars and guns. They would box in competitors, drag them out of their cars, and beat them. They would firebomb garages. Markin's home was literally firebombed in 1923. Imagine that for a second. You are trying to run a car company and your competitors are throwing explosives through your living room window. Most people would quit. Most people would sell the company and move to a farm. Markin didn't flinch. He just moved the manufacturing to Kalamazoo to keep the factory safe, but he kept fighting for the streets. This intense pressure forged a company culture that was incredibly defensive. They weren't trying to innovate for the sake of being cool. They were trying to build a tank that could survive a war zone. This mindset explains why Checker cars looked the way they did for so long. They were armor. By the time Markin bought out his rival Hertz in 1929, he had effectively created a vertically integrated monopoly. He built the cars in Kalamazoo, and he operated the fleets in the major cities. It was brilliant. He controlled the supply and the demand. If the taxi market slowed down, he could just force his own fleets to buy more cars. If the fleets were losing money, he could adjust the manufacturing costs. However, this strength was also the seed of their destruction. Because Checker was so focused on the fleet operator, they completely ignored the average driver. They ignored style trends. While Detroit was moving into the Art Deco era of the 1930s with sweeping curve and chrome grills, Checker was still building square, upright boxes. They were ugly, functional, and unapologetic. And for a long time, that worked. But here's the statistic that should blow your mind. Even at its peak, Checker was tiny. In a year where Chevrolet might produce 1 million cars, Checker would produce maybe 5,000. They were a microscopic organism living on the back of a whale. They existed only because they dominated a niche that the big three didn't think was worth the trouble. But what happens when the whale starts to get hungry? What happens when the big guys decide they want your crumb? By the time the Great Depression hit, the cracks in Markin's empire were starting to show. The stock market collapse of 1929 destroyed the taxi business. People who have no jobs don't take cabs, they walk. Checker's sales evaporated. And this is where the story shifts from a business success to a corporate thriller. Enter Errett Laban Cord. Cord was the Elon Musk of the 1930s, flashy, brilliant, and a little bit dangerous. He ran Auburn, Cord, and Duesenberg, the most prestigious luxury car brands in America. He saw Checker weakened and bleeding cash, and he decided to take it. In a hostile takeover that would make Wall Street look tame, Cord ousted Markin. He kicked the founder out of his own company. For a moment, it looked like Checker was going to become a luxury brand. Cord tried to inject style into the taxis, but Cord was running a shell game. He was manipulating stock prices, inflating values, and playing a dangerous game with the SEC. The stock of Checker, a company that was barely making cars, skyrocketed from $7 to $69 in a matter of weeks, while the rest of the country was in the breadline. It was artificial. It was fraud. When the government stepped in, Cord's empire collapsed. And who was there to pick up the pieces? Morris Markin. Like a character in a movie who returns from the dead, he bought back his company for pennies on the dollar. He had survived the Bolsheviks, Ellis Island, the taxi wars, and now a corporate raid. He reclaimed the soul of the company just in time for the world to catch fire again. When World War II broke out, Checker did what every American factory did. They stopped making civilian goods. But Markin didn't just make bullets, he tried to innovate. Checker developed a four-wheel drive prototype for the military, a vehicle that was arguably better than the Jeep in some respects. It had four-wheel steering and could crawl through mud that would swallow a tank. But the military passed on it. They wanted mass production, and Checker was too small to guarantee the volume. So instead, they built trailers and tank retrieval vehicles. They kept the lights on. But when the war ended in 1945, Markin faced a disaster that makes the taxi wars look like a playground fight. All of his pre-war tooling was gone. The heavy steel dies, the massive molds used to stamp out car fenders and doors were either scrapped for the war effort or rusted beyond repair. He had a factory, a workforce, and a brand, but he had no car. He was starting from zero. Now in business school, they'll tell you this is a pivot point. For Markin, it was an existential crisis. He hired top-tier designers, including men who had worked on luxury cars like Packard's, and told them to build the taxi of the future. And they went wild. They designed cars with rear engines, cars with front-wheel drive, and futuristic pods that look like something from the Jetsons. But here's the thing. Innovation is expensive. The Model D they developed was a technological marvel with a transverse engine and front-wheel drive, layout features that wouldn't become standard in normal cars for another 30 years. It was brilliant, it was efficient, and it was completely unbuildable for a company with Checker's budget. The cost to retool the factory for such a radical machine would have bankrupted them instantly. Markin had to make a heartbreaking choice. He looked at the future, saw it was too expensive, and turned back to the past. He took the basic pre-war engineering principles, body on frame, heavy steel, simple suspension, and just updated the look slightly. This decision birthed the cars that would eventually evolve into the A11, the icon we all know. But it also set a timer on the company's life. By choosing to be conservative, Markin ensured survival in the short term, but guaranteed obsolescence in the long term. In 1956, they released the A8, which established the box look. Then, in 1958, the A9. And finally, in 1961, the A11 Marathon. This is the car. When you close your eyes and picture a taxi, this is it. It stayed in production virtually unchanged until 1982. Think about that. In the same time frame that Ford went from the tail-finned Galaxy to the boxy LTD to the aerodynamic Taurus, Checker built the same car. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't they update it? Were they lazy? No, they were trapped. To change the design of a car, you need to machine new dies. A set of stamping dies for a whole car costs tens of millions of dollars. GM could amortize that cost over a million Chevys. Checker, selling only 5,000 to 8,000 cars a year, couldn't afford to change the turn signal lever, let alone the fender. So they marketed this stagnation as a feature. They called it continuity. They told fleet owners, look, if you buy a Checker today, the fender from your 1965 model will fit on your 1975 model. And for a mechanic running a fleet of 200 cabs, that is music to the ears. It meant you didn't need a warehouse of different parts. You just needed a pile of Checker parts. This is where it gets really interesting. The Checker A11 was a dinosaur, but it was a T-Rex. It was built like a truck. It used a heavy-duty X-frame chassis that was practically indestructible. While a Ford or a Plymouth taxi might rattle itself to death after 100,000 miles on New York potholes, Checkers were just getting warmed up. There are documented cases of these cars hitting 500,000 miles, 800,000 miles, and yes, even crossing the million-mile mark on the original frame. That is a statistic that sounds fake, but it's real. 1,000,000 miles is to the moon and back twice. The interior was pure utility. The floor was completely flat, no transmission hump, so you could slide in easily. It had jump seats, those little folding chairs in the back, so you could cram 5 people in the rear. It was cavernous. A modern Toyota Camry feels like a coffin compared to the backseat of a Checker. This made it beloved by the public. You hailed a Checker because it was comfortable. You drove a Checker because it paid the bills. But while the passengers and drivers loved them, the economics were shifting underneath Markin's feet. In the 1960s, the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, woke up. They realized that selling fleet cars was a great way to move metal during slow sales periods. They started offering taxi packages. These weren't purpose-built taxis, they were just regular sedans with heavy-duty alternators, stiffer springs, and vinyl seats. But they were cheap. A fleet owner could buy a fleet of Chevy Biscaynes or Ford Customs with significantly less than a fleet of Checkers. And sure, the Chevy might die in 3 years while the Checker lasted 10, but the upfront cost was lower. In a low-margin business like taxis, cash flow is king. Checker tried to fight back by selling to the public. They marketed the Marathon as the ultimate family car. Their ads were actually kind of brilliant in a self-depreciating way. They practically said, it's ugly, but your kids won't destroy it. They appealed to the pragmatic, no-nonsense buyer. But here's what most people don't realize. Americans buy cars with their hearts, not their brains. We want to look cool, we want speed, we want chrome. Nobody wanted to spend Cadillac money on a car that looked like it should have a meter on the dashboard. Sales to the public were abysmal, never more than a few thousand a year. And then the regulatory walls started closing in. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the US government started getting serious about safety and emissions. Seatbelts, collapsible steering columns, padded dashes, crash testing. Every new regulation required engineering time and money to implement. For GM, adding a side impact beam to a door cost pennies per car. For Checker, it was a massive capital project. They were essentially hand-building these cars in a world of robots. The factory in Kalamazoo was a time capsule. You had guys welding frames by hand, lead-filling body seams like artisans from the 19th century. It was romantic, sure, but it was financial suicide. The final nail in the coffin wasn't a regulation or a competitor, though. It was geopolitics. The 1973 oil crisis changed everything. Suddenly, gas wasn't 30 cents a gallon anymore. People were waiting in lines for fuel. The Checker A11 was a heavy, unaerodynamic brick that maybe got 10 to 12 miles per gallon if you were gentle with it. In city traffic, maybe 8. Fleet owners watched their profit margins vanish out the exhaust pipe. They started looking at the new, smaller cars coming out of Detroit and even, heaven forbid, imports. The math was ruthless. A lighter car that burned half the gas was more profitable than an indestructible tank that drank like a sailor. Checker was cornered. Their engines were sourced from GM, usually the reliable Chevy Straight 6 or the small block V8. But as GM started detuning their engines to meet emission standards, the Checkers got slower and less efficient. The car was heavy, the engine was choked, and the price tag was rising. By the late 70s, a Checker cost almost as much as a luxury Buick Riviera. Imagine walking into a dealership today and seeing a utilitarian work van priced the same as a Porsche Cayenne. Who buys the van? Nobody. Markin passed away in 1970, leaving the company to his son, David Markin. David was stuck. He knew the A11 was dead. He knew they needed a new car, but he also knew they didn't have the $50 million needed to develop one. He tried desperately to find a partner. He talked to everyone. There were rumors of a deal with Volkswagen to stretch a Rabbit. Can you imagine that? A stretched VW Rabbit as an NYC taxi? There were talks with General Motors to buy the tooling for the Chevy Citation and stretch it. They called it Project Galva. Now, if you know anything about cars, you know the Chevy Citation is widely considered one of the worst cars ever made. It was plagued with recall issues and rust problems. The fact that Checker was considering pinning their future on that platform shows you just how desperate the situation had become. They built prototypes, awkward front-wheel drive vehicles that lacked the rugged charm of the A11 and the modern efficiency of a Honda. They were the worst of both worlds. The testing went poorly. The brakes were inadequate for a heavy taxi, the suspension couldn't handle the abuse, and the cost was still too high. By 1982, the math finally ran out. The dies were worn smooth. The workers were aging. The orders had trickled to a halt. On July 12, 1982, the last Checker automobile rolled off the assembly line in Kalamazoo. It wasn't a celebration. There were no marching bands. It was a funeral. A specific era of American life ended that afternoon. The heavy steel door slammed shut for the last time. The factory, which had once smelled of fresh paint and welding ozone, fell silent. At least the assembly side did. But here's where most people stop the story. They think, 1982, Checker died, and the video. But that's wrong. Checker didn't die. It mutated. And this next chapter is arguably more fascinating because it reveals the brutal reality of the automotive supply chain. Morris Markin's son David was a pragmatist. He realized that while they couldn't build whole cars anymore, they were still really good at stamping metal. They had massive presses. They had skilled labor. And do you know who needed metal stamped? General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. So in a twist of irony, Checker Motors spent the next 27 years building parts for the very companies that had crushed them. If you drove a Dodge Ram in the 90s, the tailgate might have been stamped by Checker. If you bought a Chevy truck, the frame rails might have come from Kalamazoo. They became a Tier 1 supplier. And for a while, business was actually booming. They were making millions of dollars a year. They weren't famous anymore, but they were profitable. They had over 1 million square feet of factory space humming along, hidden in plain sight. They were the ghost in the machine of the American auto industry. This survival period proves something critical about the company. They were fighters. They adapted from tailoring to uniforms, to taxis, to fleet operations, to contract manufacturing. They refused to stay down. But while the factory was humming, the old cars themselves, the A11s, were slowly going extinct in the wild. The last Checker taxi operating in New York City was retired in 1999. Its owner, a man named Earl Johnson, had driven it nearly 1 million miles. When it was finally retired, it wasn't because the engine failed, it was because the city passed a law mandating that all taxis had to be newer than a certain age. The car was legislated out of existence because it refused to die on its own. That is a definition of legendary. However, surviving as a supplier is a dangerous game. When you build your own product, you control your destiny. When you build parts for someone else, you are at their mercy. And in 2008, the mercy ran out. The Great Recession hit the global economy like a meteor. We all remember the headlines: Lehman Brothers collapsing, the housing market imploding. But in Detroit, it was an apocalypse. GM and Chrysler were bankrupt. Ford was mortgaging everything, including its logo, just to keep the lights on. When the giants fall, the little guys get crushed. As GM and Chrysler slashed production, they stopped ordering parts. Overnight, Checker's revenue plummeted. They were holding millions of dollars in unpaid invoices from companies that were themselves insolvent. The cash flow dried up instantly. But this is Engine File, and we don't just look at the macroeconomics. We look at the human element, because even with the recession, Checker might have been able to weather the storm. They had cash reserves. They had a long history of saving money. They should have had a rainy day fund deep enough to survive a year of bad business. So where was the money? This is where the story turns into a tragedy so bizarre you couldn't write it. David Markin, the CEO, the son of the founder, had done what any wealthy businessman does. He invested his personal fortune and a significant amount of the company's stability fund, but he didn't put it in mutual funds. He entrusted it to a man who was legendary on Wall Street, a man who promised steady, impossible returns year after year, a man named Bernie Madoff. Yes, that Bernie Madoff, the architect of the largest Ponzi scheme in human history. Now, you might be thinking, what are the odds? The odds are astronomical, but it happened. The Markin family name appeared on the victim list not once, but 5 times. When the Madoff scandal broke in late 2008, it revealed that roughly $50 billion of wealth had evaporated into thin air. For David Markin, it was a wipeout. The personal wealth that could have been used to inject liquidity into Checker during the recession was gone. The safety net had been stolen. It was the perfect storm. On one side, the customers, GM and Chrysler, were bankrupt and not buying parts. On the other side, the capital reserves were stolen by a con artist. Checker Motors was caught in a vice grip between the collapse of American industry and the collapse of American finance. On January 16, 2009, Checker Motors Corp filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This time, there was no Morris Markin to borrow $25 from a janitor. There was no Cord Empire to raid. There was just a quiet, humiliating end. The liquidation was brutal. We're talking about a company that had been a pillar of Kalamazoo for nearly a century. The assets were sold off for scrap. The stamping dies, those massive multi-ton pieces of history, were melted down. The contracts were sold to competitors in Canada and Mexico. In 2010, the headquarters, the beating heart of the empire where the taxi wars were strategized, was sold for less than $3 million. That is the price of a nice house in Los Angeles, but it bought an entire industrial legacy. By the time the demolition crews arrived to tear down the factory, the weeds were already growing through the cracks in the parking lot. It's a haunting image. You have to understand, for the people of Kalamazoo, this wasn't just a business closing. It was a family member dying. Generations of men and women had worked there. Grandfathers had welded the frames of the Model A. Grandsons had stamped the tailgates for Chevy Silverados. And now it was just a pile of bricks and twisted rebar. But why does this matter to us today? Why should we care about a defunct taxi company? Because Checker represents a philosophy that we have completely abandoned. We live in a world of planned obsolescence. Your phone is designed to slow down after 2 years. Your washing machine has plastic gears that break after 5 years. Your car is a computer on wheels that becomes a brick the moment the software is no longer supported. Checker stood for the opposite. They stood for the idea that a machine should serve you, not the other way around. They believed that if you built something right, you didn't need to change it every year just to chase a trend. There is a profound sadness and realized potential that was wasted. The Model D prototype from the 1940s proves that Checker had the engineering talent to be a world leader. They had front-wheel drive before it was cool. They had the durability that Toyota later became famous for. They had the brand recognition that Tesla would kill for. They had it all, but they were paralyzed by their own success in a niche market. They became so good at being a taxi company that they forgot how to be a car company. They optimized themselves into a corner, and when the walls of that corner moved via regulation, fuel prices, and finance, they had nowhere to go. And yet, the cars refuse to leave our collective consciousness. You can still buy a Checker today, if you look hard enough. There are collectors who restore them, lovingly welding new steel into those rust-prone fenders. They drive them to car shows, and without fail, they draw a crowd larger than the Ferraris and the Lamborghinis. Why? Because the Checker is approachable. It's not a car for billionaires, it's a car for people. It reminds us of a time when you could hail a ride for a few bucks and feel like a king in the back seat. Here's a statistic that sums it up. Today, the average lifespan of an NYC taxi, usually a Toyota RAV4 or a Nissan NV200, is roughly 3 to 5 years before it's retired and scrapped. A Checker A11 had a service life of 10 to 20 years. We have technically advanced, but have we really improved? We've traded longevity for efficiency and character for comfort. It's a trade-off that makes sense on a spreadsheet, but leaves a hole in the soul of the city. The story of Checker is also a warning. It's a warning to every company that thinks it's too essential to fail. Checker thought they owned the streets. They thought the taxi industry couldn't function without them. But the world is ruthless. It will replace you with a cheaper alternative, a faster alternative, or a more efficient alternative without blinking. It will replace you, but it can never quite delete you. And this brings us to the most surprising part of the Checker saga: the afterlife. Most dead car brands stay dead. You don't see people clamoring to restore a 1985 Plymouth Reliant, but the Checker has achieved a sort of zombie immortality. In the last decade, the value of a clean A11 Marathon has skyrocketed. We are seeing resto mods where people are dropping modern LS3 Corvette engines into these old taxi bodies. It's the ultimate sleeper. You pull up to a stoplight and what looks like a heavy industrial relic, and then you leave a Porsche in the dust. It's ridiculous, it's hilarious, and it's exactly the kind of chaotic energy Morris Markin would have probably appreciated. But to truly understand why we can't let go, we need to look at the what-ifs. The archives of Checker Motors are filled with ghosts, prototypes that show a timeline where the company didn't just survive, but thrived. Most people don't realize that in the late 1960s, Checker hired the legendary Italian design house Ghia, the same people who designed cars for Ferrari and Volkswagen, to reinvent the taxi. Imagine that combination: the grit of Kalamazoo mixed with the style of Turin, Italy. They produced a prototype called the Centurion. It was sleek, angular, and frankly beautiful. It looked like a brutalist sculpture. It had the same interior volume as the A11, but with modern aerodynamics and safer crumple zones. If they had built it, the streets of New York in the 1980s wouldn't have been filled with boxy yellow cabs. They would have looked like the set of Blade Runner. But again, the villain was money. The board of directors looked at the tooling costs, looked at their bank account, and killed the project. It's one of the great missed opportunities in automotive history. Then there was the diesel experiment. Now, if you're a gearhead, you know that the 1970s and 80s were the dark ages for American diesel engines. GM's Oldsmobile diesel was a catastrophe that basically ruined the reputation of diesel in America for 30 years. Checker, trying to save fuel during the oil crisis, decided to offer a Perkins diesel option. It seemed like a smart move. Perkins diesels were legendary in tractors and boats. They were indestructible. But in a taxi, they were loud. They vibrated so hard they rattled people's teeth fillings loose. And they were slow. We were talking 0 to 60 times that could be measured with a calendar. Drivers hated them. Passengers hated them. But it showed that Checker was desperate to find a solution to the fuel economy problem without changing the body. It was like trying to make a brick fly by attaching a more efficient propeller. It didn't work because the physics were wrong. This failure highlights a specific business lesson. You cannot innovate a single component to fix a systemic problem. Checker had a systemic problem. The car was too heavy and too old. Changing the engine was a band-aid on a bullet wound. Let's shift gears and talk about the cultural psychology of the yellow paint. You might be thinking yellow is just a color, but it's not. It was a branding masterstroke that actually predates Checker, but Checker owned it. John Hertz of Yellow Cab originally chose the color because a University of Chicago study told him it was the most visible color from a distance. Markin adopted it and made it the uniform of the city. There is a psychological effect when you see a Checker. It signals safety. In the gritty, crime-ridden New York of the 70s and 80s, that yellow tank was a sanctuary. You hopped in, locked the heavy door, and you were safe. The driver might be grumpy, the seats might be torn, but you knew you were going to get there. Compare that to the modern Uber experience. You're getting into a stranger's personal gray Honda Civic. It's intimate in a weird way. You are in their space. In a Checker, you were in public space. The partition glass between the driver and the passenger was more than just a safety feature. It was a social contract. It said, I will do my job, you do yours, and we don't need to pretend to be friends. For millions of introverted New Yorkers, that was paradise. This is why the Taxi of Tomorrow project, New York's attempt to replace the fleet with the Nissan NV200 high-top fans a few years ago, never captured the public's heart. Sure, the Nissan has USB ports and a sunroof, but it feels like a shuttle bus. It feels like an appliance. It lacks the presence of the Checker. The Checker had a face. It had round headlights that looked like eyes and a grille that looked like a mouth. It had character. Humans are hardwired to anthropomorphize things. We want to see faces in our machines. When cars became aerodynamic wedges in the 90s, we lost that connection. And we can't ignore the role of Hollywood in this immortality. If Robert De Niro had driven a Dodge Diploma in Taxi Driver, would the movie be the same? Probably not. The Checker A11 was a character in that film. It was the vessel for Travis Brickley's madness. It was his cocoon. In Friends, Phoebe's grandmother's cab is a Checker. It represents quirkiness and freedom. In Home Alone 2, Kevin McAllister looks out the window of a Checker. It represents the overwhelming scale of the big city. These cultural imprints mean that even kids who were born in 2010 recognize the shape. It has transcended being a car and became a symbol, like the London black cab. And speaking of London, that's an interesting comparison. The London Taxi Company, now LEVC, managed to survive. How? They mandated the design. London protects its taxi heritage with fierce regulations. The US didn't. We let the free market decide, and the free market decided that a Ford Crown Victoria was good enough. The Crown Vic, by the way, is the only other car that even comes close to the Checker's legacy. And it's ironic because the Crown Vic killed the Checker. It was faster, cheaper, and more comfortable. But now, even the Crown Vic is gone, replaced by hybrids and crossovers. We are moving further and further away from the sedan, from the car. We are moving into the era of the mobility pod. And this brings us to the present day. There is a company right now in 2024 trying to bring the Checker back. Not the old company, but a new startup that bought the rights to the name. They are sketching designs for a modern electric Checker. It looks like the old A11 but smoothed out, with LED lights and batteries in the floor. It's a bold idea, but can you resurrect a soul? Can you manufacture nostalgia? Usually, the answer is no. You can look at the new VW Beetle or the PT Cruiser. They were fun for a few years, but they were novelties. They weren't workhorses. The original Checker wasn't trying to be retro. It was just old. There's a difference. Authenticity is something you earn through survival, not something you design in a studio. But let's look deeper at the numbers. At the auction block today, a Checker A11 in rough condition might fetch $10,000. A pristine, restored one can hit $50,000 or more. That is a 500% increase in value over the last decade. That beats the S&P 500. It beats gold. It turns out that the rusty old taxis were actually a better investment than the stocks Morris Markin's son was buying. Here's what most people don't realize about the collector market for these things. It's incredibly difficult to restore one. Why? Because they were tools. They were used up. Finding a low-mileage checker is like finding a low-mileage hammer. It doesn't exist. If it had low miles, it meant it was broken. Most of the survivors are Frankensteins, welded together from 3 different donor cars. This scarcity drives the value up, but it also makes the history fragile. We are losing the physical evidence of this company every time one rusts away in a junkyard. And the factory in Kalamazoo? The site is now a brownfield, partially redeveloped. But if you go there, you can still find old employees in the local diners. They tell stories about the hand-built quality. They talk about how they used to hand-file the door gaps to make them perfect. In an era where Tesla owners complain about panel gaps on a $100,000 car, it is humbling to think that a taxi company in 1960 cared more about fit and finish than some modern luxury brands. There is a lesson in manufacturing here. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. Checker built cars slowly. They didn't rush, and because of that, the cars stayed on the road for 20 years. Modern manufacturing is all about speed. Get it out the door, fix it with a software update later. We have gained efficiency, but we have lost integrity. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a difficult paradox that every entrepreneur and engineer needs to look at closely. Checker proves that product perfection and business survival are not the same thing. In fact, they might be enemies. If you build a product that never breaks, you eventually run out of customers. If you refuse to compromise on quality to meet a lower price point, the market will eventually leave you behind for a cheaper, good-enough alternative. Checker was the last honest car company. They didn't try to trick you with planned obsolescence. They didn't try to sell you a lifestyle. They sold you a steel box that worked, and the market punished them for it. There is something deeply American about that tragedy. We love to tell stories about how quality wins, but the reality is often that convenience wins or cheap wins. Checker refused to play that game. They stood their ground on the principle that a taxi should be safe, spacious, and durable. They went down with the ship rather than turning into just another badge-engineered clone of a Chevy or a Ford. There is dignity in that kind of failure. It is the failure of the craftsman in a world of mass production. But beyond the metal and the business logic, the story of Checker is the story of the immigrant dream coming full circle. Morris Markin came to this country with nothing, built an empire, and changed the landscape of our cities. His cars carried millions of people to job interviews, to first dates, to hospitals, and to airports. They were the silent witnesses to the 20th century. Inside those cabs, people fell in love, broke up, made deals, and cried. The car was just a vessel, but it was a vessel that held the collective anxiety and hope of the city. When the company finally dissolved in the chaos of 2009, stripped bare by the recession and the Madoff scandal, it felt like a betrayal of that original dream. It showed that no matter how hard you work, no matter how tough you build your walls, you are never truly safe from the storms of finance and fate. The family fortune that took 80 years to build was wiped out in seconds by a man in a penthouse office who had never welded a frame in his life. That is the final bitter irony. The real things, the steel, the factories, the cars, were destroyed by the fake things, the Ponzi schemes, the derivatives, the shell games. However, we can choose to remember the triumph rather than the tragedy. We can look at those surviving A11s not as failures, but as monuments. They are reminders that we once built things to last. They are proof that for a brief moment in history, a tailor from Russia could take on the titans of Detroit and carve out a space for himself. And even though the factories are gone, the spirit of the Checker is still out there. It's in every mechanic who refuses to cut corners. It's in every engineer who fights to make a product more durable than the spreadsheet says it should be. If you're the kind of person who appreciates that kind of stubborn quality, then you are part of the legacy too. you are keeping the idea alive. This has been Engine File. If this deep dive into the forgotten history of America's most iconic taxi helped you understand the ruthless mechanics of the car world a little better, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We have plenty more stories of gears, gasoline, and glory coming your way. Until the next ride, keep the meter running.